Hello, it's Adedoyin Jaiyesimi here, and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is the third module in the Mastering the Art of Church Communications Bite-Size Comms course. So far, we've learned about the foundations of church communications. We've also looked at how to build your church communication strategy. In this model, I'm going to be teaching you about how to structure your church communication. So let's get into it. Now, as I shared at the beginning of the course in the intro video, and I'm going to really talk more about my experiences working in-house within a church communications function, but I wanted to get out the fundamentals first, which is why I focused more on the principles and how you need to think through developing your strategy, understanding the fundamental and foundational questions to ask. But another thing that I felt like it was really essential to highlight is terms of structure, because depending on the size of your church or your ministry, your communications team may be filled with more volunteers than in-house team members. So how do you build a structure where even if you have a lot of volunteers, you are engaging them effectively, you are building a team that is competent and capable? And that's what I'll be talking about here. Now, this is a sample team structure. This team structure works for big or bigger churches, maybe churches that have multiple branches, multiple campuses. But I always like to think about what the best case scenario is and then contextualize for my own unique context as well. So that way I can say, okay, I can take this and adapt or iterate for myself, which is why I'm starting with this, because some of you will be like, we don't have all of these people in our comms team. Fear not. But let's look at what a good structure is, right? So you have executive leadership where the senior pastor or the chief operating officer. So in Victor Adedoyin Ministries, for example, we had the senior pastor and then we had the COO, who I was actually directly reporting to both the senior pastor and the COO, because my role was a dual role. So I was the brand communications manager at Victor Adedoyin Ministries, but I had oversight on church communications for 12 branches of the church. Man, I'll share in the next module, that experience. It was interesting. But yeah, that was the structure that we had at the time in that role. So that's executive leadership. And then depending on, again, your church, you then have different maybe campus pastors and all, but this is not supposed to be an organogram for the church. It's meant to be for your comms team. Directly, you should be reporting to either the COO or the senior pastor, depending on what the structure look like. Then you then have your communications director or head of communications. Look, any church that wants to do communications well, you need to have a person that is skilled in communications as a discipline. It cannot be, oh, this person just likes to post on social media. Oh, this person is a good writer, so therefore they are the head of the communications department. No. It's that this person is skilled. It's like this person is qualified. The accountant of the church is a qualified accountant, right? The person may not have ACCA, but they are qualified to do that role. They probably have ICANN, right? So, hey, it's the same thing. Person needs to be a qualified communications professional. So important. And that person can be the head of communications, depending on the structure, can be the comms director. Then the other layers, which can now be flexible based on how big or how complex your communication stream is within your church or the network, is having a content team. This messaging is very, very important. And that's something that I feel like a lot of churches can do better at, because you take the videos, you put them on social media. That's where it ends. What is the message? What exactly are we saying here? So you need to have people that are skilled, and this is a skill. A good writer may not be someone that knows how to or understands the nuance of message drafting, especially within the context of the church. So you have your copywriters, editors. You may or may not have script writers, right? It really just depends on what your church is doing. So if your church, for example, has a lot of campaigns, you may need script writers to script out the campaigns. If you do documentaries, it depends on the kind of content. So in one of the churches that I worked, for example, the pastor would go on TV, but he was more of a person that he used to flow. Like, he had a very good flow in terms of what he wanted to say. So there wasn't so much of a need to develop script, but there were campaigns that we would do for the church, and it would be necessary to do the script and then the media. So somebody will voice the scripts. So for church announcements, for example, you want to communicate about a particular event, you may need a script writer, but not compulsory. Then you have your digital media team, your social media manager, community manager. Not a lot of churches have community managers, and it's so important, and especially because we're in the era of community, right? You have to be able to nurture the community, and community managers, what they help to do is just maintain that consistent flow of communication. So here you have your social media manager, and depending on how big your church is, depending on how many platforms you engage on, you should not have a one size fits all community or social media manager. You may decide to split them according to platforms, right? Somebody may be responsible for Instagram, another person TikTok, because the mistake you don't want to make is take the same content and post it across all platforms with the same messaging, because all the platforms are not the same. And then you have your creative design team. So these are the people responsible for graphics, illustration, designing of the brand, everything visual is them in terms of graphics and branding. Then you have your video and media production team. So your videographers, photographers, editors, that's where they sit. A lot of churches are good with that. So they have a strong media team. Please note that media team is not the same as a communication team. So your media team is responsible for the visual output. So the pictures, the videos, the editing, but they are not responsible for the message crafting. They're not responsible for the overarching strategy. There has to be an overarching strategy in which your media now operates under. So if you're just doing media and whatever media churns out, that's what you're going with, you need to go back to the drawing board, which is why the previous model will be very helpful for you. Then you have your web and tech team. So you have the web manager, SEO specialist. Now you may not need this if you don't have a very big church, but you need somebody that is managing your website, managing the blog, managing content, so you can keep updating, making sure that your website is current, is up to date, your programs are there. I'm not going to your website and I'm seeing a program from 2024 kind of thing. And then PR team, you may or you may not need this. In one of the churches that I worked, there was a PR team because certain aspects of what the church was doing required media relations, right? And so we had, I think there was even one thing that we did, that we had a press conference, if I'm not wrong. So that person, it's all about the media, press liaison, and then crisis communications. I don't see a lot of churches do crisis communications, right? And that usually it becomes apparent when some sort of issue pops up. The response is usually knee-jerk. For you to have a solid and effective communications, there has to be an element of crisis anticipation, crisis response, because we don't live in a perfect world. So if a crisis happens, if your pastor gets dragged, what are we going to say? But I think I'll touch on that later. And then you then have the different ministry departments. For example, I used to interface with maybe the singles team, youth pastor, evangelism team, just understanding their communication needs, making sure it's part of the bulletin, part of the things that we communicate as the broader information that we wanted to share about the church. So like I said, this is a very elaborate team structure. Yours, depending on your context, may be simpler, but please, these key roles, think about it. Do we have people that can handle contents and they're skilled at it? Digital media, the creative design, the video, the web. We may not need PR. And then at the head of all of this, do we have a skilled communications professional? Emphasis on skill. This is no, oh, I'm a creative, I can do comms. No, is that you went to school or you've taken training, you have a certification, and you know how to do this very well. It's so important. So here's just a breakdown of what I've shared before. To do church communications effectively, you need a competent and well-trained team. So irrespective of whether you're big or you're small, church or ministry, you need a head of communications or a communications manager. And this is somebody that is highly skilled, has core competencies in strategic communications, reputation management, and crisis management. Then you need your social manager, who is responsible for curating content, posting and engaging on social media. The editorial staff, remember I told you about messaging. So they're writing content, they're drafting messaging across the multiple platforms. You have your photographer, who is all about the images and visual documentation, your videographer for visual storytelling, and then you need your volunteers. The reality of church communications is that you actually do need volunteers, especially on Sunday and special programs, but your structure is not heavily reliant on volunteers. And even where you have volunteers for comms support, it's also important that they are well resourced and skilled in what they are doing. So every member of the team needs to be trained in the fundamentals of strategic communications and the nuance of church communications. We could get away with just doing things, as the spirit leads and all of that 10 years ago when I first years started in this space. However, because of the way the industry has evolved, because of the way the times, the society has evolved, that training is very, very important if we want to be effective in this role as church communicators. So generally, these are some of the key skills, and I've touched on it in the previous model: strategic communications. Look, I will keep saying this. Please master this, especially if you're going to be the head of the communications department. You need to know strategic communication, and it can be learned. It's something that you can learn in class. There are books to read. I have a bite-sized comms course on strategic communications and like a mini course on my YouTube channel as well. And I train teams and organizations on this. Writing, great writing skills is very important. You don't want somebody that will be, making grammatical errors and mistakes on your social media pages. Content creation, relationship building. It's so, so important as a communications person, because you're going to be interfacing with people, different stakeholders within the church and outside the church. So how do you build relationships? How do you get buy-in? Again, I'll touch more on the next model of just some practical things and experiences that I have. But you need to have good relationship building skills, because sometimes people's perception, or a lot of times people's perception of communications, first of all, they think you're media. Then they think you're just there to capture content and post on social media. They don't realize the depth, the critical thinking that's involved. They don't even realize the why of certain things. So you need to be able to build relationships. You need to be able to influence, to say, hey, we need to do this because of this particular thing, or for us to get this outcome. I remember one time in one of the roles that I was in, I will not mention which of them. So it's at the GLS, the Global Leadership Summit. And, one of the pastors, one of the branch pastors came and said, oh, just look at these people, look at their communications, look at this. He was trying to compare and saying that, oh, our own output, trying to just, shade us in some way. I said, no problem. I like to communicate with data. So one of the days I was scrolling on social media, and they happened to do a post about their team, the team behind the scene responsible for all the things you were. I just did check out. I just did a screenshot, and I went to go and meet him. And like, yes, if you want us to achieve this outcome and these things that you say that you like that they did, just look at how many people are in the team. Because then it was just me, and then I was the only full-time comms person, and then we had volunteers, and then the other branches, it was just volunteers. And I said, look, this is the number of people on this. Do you see how many photographers are there? Do you see how many? And man, he got the message. So it's very important that we paint a realistic picture. So don't just compare me with some other ministry when I don't have the same people or resources. But it's also that wisdom as well in saying, look, this is why we're recommending this. This is why we're saying we shouldn't do this. Your ability to listen is also very important. A good communicator is somebody that listens. You listen to your pastors, you listen to your members, you listen to what are people saying, not because you want to be swayed by it, but because you want to get feedback. You want to say, okay, are there things that we need to change? Is our message even landing well? Or because you don't want to be tone deaf. Is it landing well? Is it resonating? What is the pulse and the heart of the people in this time? And adaptability is so key, right? You can develop your strategy at the beginning of the year, but your strategy is not cast in stone. Things can change, things can happen, and it's very important for you to be able to adapt and adjust depending on whatever, changes need to be made. So your tactics can always change, right? The crux of how we want to do certain things. We have our vision, we have the overarching goals, but how we achieve it based on maybe things that happen as the year unfolds may mean we should change. In fact, even your ministry, the program of activities may change. So you need to be able to adapt and course correct. Conflict resolution. Oh my God. In fact, this one I can speak. I can speak on it. There's wisdom involved in doing this role, right? You're managing different personalities, and because it's church, right? There's that notion of it's church. Sometimes some people, the way they won't behave outside, they will behave like that in church. The things they may not necessarily say to other people in another kind of context, they feel it's okay for them to say it to you, and you must be able to resolve conflicts without offense, right? And that is so important. I've gotten accused of, oh, you favor this person, you're always putting this person's picture, you're always doing, and I'm just like, please, I'm just doing my work. This person is evoking the emotions that I need, because when I'm screening pictures after service, like I said, said before in the previous model, every service that we go into, every program, we have the story that we want to tell, we have what we want to communicate. And so when the assets start coming in, we sieve based on those parameters. So if this person week in, week out fits into the parameters, was my own. But again, there's now that wisdom of, okay, let's balance things. And I had to learn that on the job. Cultural sensitivity is so important. A church is filled with people from different cultural backgrounds, different upbringings. For some of you may have different nationalities. You've got to learn how to deal with that. And even when you communicate on social media, because your church is going to be visited by people across the world, it's also really understanding that cultural sensitivity. In fact, the terminology now for communications professionals is cultural intelligence, right? Because again, it's such a key thing. And then diplomacy and tact, which I kind of touched on in the conflict resolution. Diplomacy is very needed, very, very needed. So these are some of the skills that you will need. Now, something that is really, really important if you want to have an effective structure within your communications team, you need policies and guidelines. It's so, so important. How do we communicate? What is the process? It's not haphazard. Any church or ministry that is doing communications haphazardly, you're not doing it right. And there will be challenges. In fact, there will likely be issues down the line because it is haphazard. And what happens when you have policies and guidelines is that when you then have volunteers, when you have people that are temporary staff, you can guide them in the process of, this is how we do things here. Even if you don't have a full-time communications manager or head of communications, you kind of have a structure of, here is how we do things here. And it's almost that thing of, when things are documented, it can be replicated to the same level of standard and excellence that you would require. So one of the first things I would really encourage you to do is to have a communications policy. And your communications policy has to document how we communicate as a church. What topics or themes do we cover? Churches, depending on the strength or the gifting of the lead pastor, they touch on different topics. So there are churches that are very heavy on relationships, some very heavy on faith, very heavy on healing, right? It's still all about the message of the gospel of Christ. But depending on whether the gift of the lead pastor is prophetic, with expressing a teacher, is he more apostolic, is he pastoral, that kind of also determines the kind of topics that they touch on regularly. And if you think about it, when you think about wisdom, some pastors readily come to mind. When you think about healing, when you think about faith, not that they don't talk about other things, but that's really like where their area of strength is, or the concentration that people know them for. So you need to know, in terms of how we communicate, what topics or what themes do we cover? Do we cover all, and then we have a skew towards a particular theme or topic, or do we just go with the flow of, okay, this February is Valentine's season, we're going to talk about love, March is Women's Month, I don't know. So your communications policy needs to really state that out, that how it's also aligned with remember, it always has to be tied to what the overarching church of ministry vision and direction is. What kind of words and language do we use when we communicate, right? You don't want to speak absolute Christianese. You're communicating to both the people that believe or share your faith and the people who do not. And so you have to communicate in language that meets them, in the middle, right? So it's not overly Christianese. I'm not reading, I'm like, what are these people talking about? And even sometimes, even within churches, there is language that is unique to your church, that if I don't go to your church, I'm a believer, but I don't go to your church, I'm not going to understand. So those things, you can keep them for internal things, and maybe on social media, not that you won't even communicate them at all, because again, that's how your church, that's your church speak, quote and unquote, but maybe you limit the number of posts that have that, so that people are not alienated with the language. So again, documented. These are the kind of words that we use. These are the kinds of words we do not use. How is content captured within the church? And this is something that every communications team needs to sit down and really discuss. What is our policy to capturing content? Are we going to be capturing people when they are manifesting and falling down, rolling on the floor? Are we going to capture people when they're in vulnerable states, when they're crying? You have to really determine it. I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong, but you have to really sit down. And if you're going to say that, okay, we're going to capture this content, why are you going to capture it? And then how will you do it safely? When I work with some development organizations, there's something called safeguarding. So safeguarding is when you're going to places with vulnerable individuals. So whether people that have a particular disease, they're vulnerable in a certain type of way, there's safeguarding in how you document content of those people, whether it is pictures, whether it's their videos, how you show their faces. Like, it's a real training. I remember the last one that I did about 2 years ago. Everyone, we have to go through it. This is how you don't capture this video. This is how you do it. This is how you do it, so that you preserve the dignity of that person. That's the essence of that safeguarding. So as a church, it's going to be very important for you to have those important conversations, because now people are speaking up about it. Junior church, do we want to be taking the pictures of all the children and putting them on social media? Is there a risk to that? And you have to discuss it. And when you agree on this is the decision, make sure that you have a why, so that you can easily communicate it. What is our policy in terms of when people come into our church? Do we have a messaging that lets them know that, hey, content is being captured and will be posted on social media? Do we have an opt-out clause, for example? So if people do not want to be captured, are they going to wear certain bands? Are we going to put them in certain spaces so the photographers and videographers do not go there? All of those things, because again, consent is a big thing now, and that includes you within the church, right? So let me tell you the hack in terms of how I've navigated this in the past. So first timers, for example, because I don't know them, I don't know their leanings, we tend to stay off, or I used to tend to stay off first timers. So within the church, I build up my own team of social media people. So people that will go to for content, people that we know that, yes, they love pictures, they love being on social media. So I tend to focus on those people, and so that the content is not stale, you're not focusing on the same people, you kind of nurture. So have within the choir, I will have my people, within the welcome team, ushering team, even the congregation. So I kind of know that, okay, these people are, okay with being, captured, and also within you to capture them in their vulnerable moments. So it's writing, joy, just expressions in that way. So again, these are conversations that need to be had, and it needs to be documented in your communications policy. How do we see consent for content captured in church? I've touched on that. And then what is the review and approval process for content to be used on social media? There needs to be some sort of review and approval process. So me, for example, I was the final person that would give approval. And so when we discuss the overall direction, they go and take all of the content, pictures, videos, and then someone does the sieving based on the parameters, and then I see and I'm like, okay, use this, let's use that, and then we go with that based on what we have agreed on. Are there times where maybe we've posted and we have to bring things down? Of course, we are human beings, we're not perfect, but we had a system in which we had to do things. So if we had to pull down a post, there was maybe somebody missed something, or something there was an information that we didn't have, maybe a guest speaker that came with someone that didn't want, all those things that just happen that you don't foresee. So we had a policy in terms of how content is reviewed and approved, even captions before they're posted. The next is brand guidelines. This one is very important for consistency and standardization. If you have your church, your ministry, multiple branches and campuses, it's so important. Like sometimes you go some churches, you see one campus or one branch, the color is this shade. Then you look at another one, it's another shade. Then you see, and I see the nuance. So sometimes and I'm just going to give this example. So maybe in Lagos, right, the churches that are on Lagos Island, so VI, Ikoyi, Lekki, it has a more polished and bougie type of look, and then you now see their branch in maybe another city that is not so big, and it's just looking a bit like what's happening here? Is this the same church? Like you can see the disparity like night and day. It shouldn't be so. And I know that yes, the church that might be in a remote location in another state, they may not have the same quality equipment, but there needs to be a foundational standard, and that's something that I had to do in the role where I had to manage 12 branches of churches, because they didn't have the same level of equipment at the disposal. So HQ obviously has more equipment than maybe one in maybe Ado-Ekiti, a branch in Ado-Ekiti, for example. So how do we create some sort of baseline standard? Your brand identity helps with that. So the approved logos, colors, fonts, and templates work very well in this. For the campuses and branches that may not be able to afford a graphic designer, if it's not centralized, and this is another, there's so much to say here. So is communication centralized or is it decentralized? So if it's centralized, is that HQ, that's the headquarters, handles everything communications and then disperses it to the campuses. But that's not always effective, right? Especially because branches will have their own programs. So usually communications is decentralized. Even if communication is decentralized, there needs to be a standard in terms of fonts, in terms of templates, especially to support the branches that don't have the same level of resources or same level of quality equipment. So templates really does help to create that, that kind of look and feel as well. And what I did for those branches that maybe they didn't have a quality camera was to say, okay, this is how to capture the best kind of shots using this phone or equipment that you have, and then getting them to learn more about editing, getting them to learn more about, okay, how do you capture the best pictures with even this camera, this equipment that you have, because you have to maintain some sort of standard. It's very important. And then you also provide guidelines on how your church's brand identity should be used, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Please, this thing is very, very, very important. Then tone and style. Your brand guidelines would really define what kind of tone. Are we warm? Are we welcoming? Are we clear? What kind of, again, language, what kind of words do we use? What's the tone that we evoke? Are we being helpful? Are we encouraging? Are we the best friend next door? Really be clear on that. And then how and in what way will scripture be used? So do we use scripture to encourage? Do we use scripture to motivate? Do we use scripture to instruct? Do we use scripture only when like our pastor is talking, contextualizing the scripture, or we'll just put it there? Are we using it to share a promise for the week or promise for the day? How are we using scripture? Because again, that is the foundation of what it is that we are communicating as church communicators. Now, like I said before, templates, incorporate approved templates for flyers, slides, social media, and newsletters. Very, very important. Templates really, really work. And Canva is a platform that really just in a very low cost way helps you to develop templates. If your church, you don't have such a large budget for this, you can just use Canva and everybody does plug and play with that if you don't have an in-house graphic designer. And then your social media policy, please, you need a social media policy, and this will give you guidance on how social media will be used, who is authorized to post on the church's social media accounts, what are the guidelines for creating and capturing content to be used on social media, how will you respond to comments, especially from trolls. You say, excuse me, please, you are on the fastest path to hell because of these comments. No, you can't do that, right? Even though, yeah, some comments you can just be like, wow, a human being wrote this comment. How will you deal with the comments? Are you going to be deleting the comments? What are you going to do? Are you going to ignore? It really depends on, again, what is the strategy? What are we trying to do here? And how are we going to respond? These things, when you think about them in advance and have a plan, it helps you not to be flustered when they do happen, because your response is in alignment with the approved strategy. And whatever strategy and policies that you have, you also need the buy-in of the senior pastor, so everybody's on the same page, as this is how we roll here in communications. Here I just put a sample of a content approval workflow, right? So communication request is submitted by ministry, and so maybe choir needs a flyer for something, they're doing a special worship event. The communication team reviews the request details. So you need to have a process where, so people should not just be coming to you and say, oh, we are doing this outreach. Comes media, we need this, we need to put it in announcements. There needs to be a form, there needs to be a process, otherwise you're just going to be really overwhelmed, right? What is the process? Fill in the details. Then who drafts the content? Are they going to be the ones to send the caption, or the comms teams develop the caption once they're giving us all the information? Then we look at the internal review, ministry review, so you send it to the people higher up in terms of accuracy, context check, especially when you're quoting things about the scripture, just making sure it's aligned. And then you get your final approval, then you publish, and then you monitor for engagement and feedback. Your process can look, your workflow can be very different, but this is just a sample. My point really is you do need to have a workflow, you need to have policies, you need to have guidelines, and they need to be properly documented. Issues of management and crisis response. This is very, very important. One of the things I like to teach comms teams is about communications or reputation risk, and that's also also important for church. Yes, you're preaching about Jesus. Yes, your pastor is great and all, but the truth about it is that issues can arise, crises can arise, and it's good for you to be able to anticipate that. And that's really what issues management and crisis response is all about. How do you plan to handle and mitigate risks if they happen? So if your pastor is dragged on social media or gets called out, what do you do as a communications team, right? Behind the scenes, the pastoral team will be thinking about, okay, how do we do what as a communications team? What would you advise? You should be able to advise them. Okay, no, actually, let's not do that. If they say, oh, we should ignore, if it's not going to be good to ignore, why what should we be doing? You should be able to advise on that. If a member faces a scandal that is then linked to the church, I think there was an example of this some years ago where I think maybe somebody paid tithes somewhere. It found out that the person was a bit fraudulent, and that particular pastor refunded that money. It was a very interesting case at the time. But anything can happen. So all these things, you can't really say, oh, my church, we're the best. We don't have crisis. Issues can spring up from anywhere. You can have a health and safety related issue that happens within the church premises. How do you deal with that if that gets on social media? Or church drama spills into social media, because these days anything happens, people have brought out their phone, they're already tagging, they don't even know the context. So again, what your issues management and crisis response looks at is, when do we respond? When do we stay silent? If we respond, how do we respond? And you don't decide this on your own. You need to be able to sit with your pastoral team, and as a ministry, as a church, we then, it's scenario planning, right? You look at the different scenarios and what would be our reaction? What would we say? What would we put as a holding statement? Will we engage a crisis communications firm? But it's just good to have a plan. The next thing is training of team members. Like I've said before, everybody needs to be trained, including your volunteers. And so periodic training should be scheduled in the operations of the team. And I remember when I was in Global Harvest Church, we had, I think it was quarterly training. We trained on different topics. We had people, some of the training I took myself, some we listened to experts. So you should be training your team in best practices and improving their core communications competencies, because things are rapidly changing and evolving in terms of communications. Now we're dealing with AI. How should AI be used in communications, especially for church, for example, right? What are the best practices? Because when you have skilled and trained people, it's going to really have an impact on the results and the outputs that they're able to deliver, and also how they're able to deliver outcomes that are aligned with what the church wants to do. So the effectiveness, you just have to be trained. That's just it. And then you need training to distill communication trends and how it applies within the ministry context. It is not every trend that is going on in the world that your church needs to jump on. So you need to be able to say, okay, what is something that is trending? Is it in alignment with our church? Is it in alignment with our brand? Is it in alignment with our persona? Are we passing on this? Even if we jump on this trend, how are we going to do it in a way that is tasteful? Because sometimes I've seen some churches jump on some trends. I'm like, why? You don't really need this, but I don't know. I don't know why they made the choice. But you also have to think about, how does this apply within the ministry context? And then finally, knowledge exchange and exposure to experts in the field, right? So it doesn't have to be, somebody that is skilled in church communications. To learn about branding from someone that has done branding for global organizations, you pick one or two things from that person, you learn about their experiences and see what you can bring to your own context as well. So that is very important. Please, 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 if your team has never been trained, please prioritize that. Let them really understand that there's so much more to communicating on behalf of a church than just posting on social media, putting videos on YouTube. There's so much more to it. Like this thing, I can train for the whole day, but the essence of this bite-sized comms course is to just really focus on the fundamentals. So you can see I'm not going too deep, but there's a lot that I can say. So what I would really suggest is develop a comprehensive communications handbook that has how you operate as a team, has your policies, has your guidelines, and you can use that to onboard new members, either their full-time staff or their volunteers. This is how we communicate, and it's going to be a living, breathing document. There's certain things in that document that will change as the vision of the church or the priorities of the church change, but there's some things that will be static. Like these are the things that are static in terms of our messaging, in terms of our approach, in terms of our why, and then you have other things that may change in terms of our brand. But this communications handbook will be very, very important. So we've come to the end of the third modules. I hope that this has given you clarity and more information in terms of how to structure your comms team. And I hope that I made it practical enough. I would really like for you to be able to take one or two things back, which you can begin to implement. How do we structure our team better? How do we make sure that we're working effectively? How do we make sure that we're highly skilled and competent in this field, in this discipline? So we do this work to get the results. And what the results do we want to see? We want to see people embracing the Jesus way of life, the Christ way of life. We want to see people being empowered to becoming who God has created them to be. We want to amplify the message of the gospel, amplify the message of our church. We want to build a community of believers who are transformation agents. And how do we leverage the power of strategic communications to be able to do that? So if you take all the things that I've shared in these 3 modules, then it helps you to be in a better position to be able to deliver on that. So thank you so much for watching. In the final module, I'm now going to be sharing my personal journey, some of the lessons, mistakes, highs and lows, and I pray that that would also be beneficial for you. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.